Cher Albert Camus. I'm sorry that I never got the chance to read you while you were still alive. But you hit that tree 4 years before my birth, so we never coincided, although we should have. You were the first proper author I read, age 14, when had you have lived, you would have been only 64. Without you I never would have got into reading, so I'll always have this debt to you. The Outsider really spoke to the teenage me, who was beginning to turn his face from the enclosed domestic world of his childhood out towards the world at large. Your existentialist view of the world helped form my own. Though I have to ask, when that tree loomed up large in your vision the moment before your car hit it, did a smile play across your face at the randomness and meaninglessness of it all, in true existential fashion? I mean this with great respect. The luxury car company that manufactured that model went out of business in the year of my birth. Good, I say, even if I cannot claim vengeful credit. I don't reread books. Thanks to you opening up a lifelong hunger for novels, there are always too many new books to read to spend the luxury of time going back over ones already read. Having said that, for a decade I would zealously reread The Outsider every year. 102 pages, deceptively simple language, so much so it was on the A-level French exam syllabus. And yet there were new insights to be gleaned on each read. The morality in that book, together with that of the fallen judge character in your novel The Fall, have led me to being a believer in moral relativism ever since, and do battle with the moral fundamentalists in my own fiction. Your short story The Renegade is a wonderful disemboweling of the religious missionary's faith, and of the whole colonial thrust of Christian conversion. I loved that it was your beloved desert that did for him in the story. You were a remarkable blend of the Algerian and the French, and that fed through into your writing. Plus you were a goalkeeper, nor did you let tuberculosis consume you as it did Kafka. You were too smart to succumb to the Stalinist apologists who dominated the post-war world of French letters, and Sartre cannot hold a candle to you intellectually or artistically. Have you ever tried to read his trilogy? The Outsider knocks his nausea into a cocked hat for the seminal novel on existentialism. When I was growing up, The Outsider, Salinger's Catch It in the Rye, and John Fowles's The Magus were the three de rigueur books for teenage males to read. I hated The Magus, by the way, and 20 years later Donna Tartt rewrote it for her debut The Secret History. But I'm not sure young males growing up now necessarily see the need to read anything as part of the rite of passage into adulthood, and that makes me sad. As does the fact I don't get the sense that anyone makes pilgrimages to the tree that killed you, like they do for Mark Bolan, or for Jim Morrison's grave at Père Lachaise. But then France has never had much of a pop culture, though it is one of the few cultures that treats its artists and intellectuals like pop stars. But then you would have hated any such reverence, or at least shrugged it off as absurd. Thanks for the wise words for such young and tender minds, Albert. I know you played goalkeeper and not striker, but your work really knocks it in the back of the net every time. Repose en paix, Mark Nash. Dear Herr Kafka, I'm not going to apologise for not having read you while you were still alive, since you died a decade before my own father was even born. Besides, virtually no one read you while you were still alive, which makes your decision to ask for your work to be burned on your death understandable. But I'm glad Max Brod ignored your wishes and saved your work, and thereby increased the quality of all human knowledge and art. Hardly anyone reads my work, but I would never request for it to be destroyed. Your work did end up on bonfires under the hands of the Nazis. I'm relieved you never had to experience that. But I think you knew some form of it was coming, didn't you? Your writings about the faceless, all-powerful state seem to suggest that. You saw the modern world more clearly than most, and it did not appeal to you. But neither were you in favour of the stifling manners of the past. You were a man out of his time, or possibly with no time at all. Of all writers, I identify most closely with you, though my writing is nothing like yours. I too had a monstrously overbearing father, and I too wrote a letter to him. I delivered mine, and it had disastrous consequences, I can tell you. So you were probably wise not ever to send yours. That's the thing about setting words down on paper. They stay there forever. Unless you ask them to be burned, of course. But it was also your job as an insurance clerk, which you bore with equanimity despite its crushing nature on a poetic soul, I can also relate to. I think of all artists, it was you and Joy Division singer Ian Curtis who both lived their illness and yet also ploughed on through to keep making your remarkable art. He with his epilepsy, you with your consumption. He was consumed by his affliction and guilt and ultimately ended his own life. You just bore yours and allowed it to quietly fade you away. Guilt is an annihilating emotion. You raised it to a high art. The Metamorphosis is, in my opinion, the greatest short story ever written. Were you familiar with the theories of Freud? That story in particular seems to teem with Oedipal desires and fantasies. But I also really like your novels. To think that none of them were ever completed. I wonder if that means they were still first drafts, really. Worked on and honed as you went along, but still never a completed beginning to end for any of them, and yet each masterpieces. I've seen the old Jewish cemetery in Prague in which you are buried. I couldn't find your grave, but then they are so densely concentrated into such a small space, that's hardly surprising. I hate to think of you amongst the jumbled mass of humanity of that graveyard, but it also seems somehow appropriate to your writings. The masses of the modern society, both inchoate and yet confined, as pertains to the heedless, faceless state power that legislates over them. I hope you are at guilt-free rest now, though like Beckett, you seem to bear the affliction of your soul with equanimity, grace, and not a little humour. Yours, Mark Nash. Dear David Markson, I apologise for not having read any of your work while you were still alive. There is really no excuse, as I was in my 40s and well into literature by the time of your final decade. I just hadn't come across your name or work, but that will probably come as no surprise to you. Still, it makes me sad. There again, only coming to prominence as an author in your 60s gives me hope for myself, even though there is scant prospect for a long career by that stage. When I first read you, I thought we wouldn't be able to get on. Wittgenstein's Mistress left me bemused, though it did perhaps chime and underpin those occasional notions of solipsism that strike many of us, that there is no such thing as a shared observable world out there. I must admit, it was quite a while before I picked you up again, but I'm so glad and not a little relieved that I did. The trilogy, This Is Not a Novel, Vanishing Point and The Last Novel, is perhaps the most brilliant contribution to the fictional form of the novel in half a century. And also the most brilliant piece of chutzpah too, getting other writers and artists et al. To effectively write it for you. A work of fiction composed almost entirely by the words, sayings and facts of everyone in your reading life who has come before you. Stunning sleight of hand. And I have to say, with 3 to 4 years between publication of each of the 3 novels, had I read them while you were still alive, I might have felt a bit cheated because they are virtually the same, or at least employ the same technique. But fortunately, reading them together in one volume, their similarity made perfect sense. All us writers stand upon the shoulders of literary giants who preceded us. The struggle is to establish what mark, if any, and what legacy our work will leave. What will be our lasting contribution to the pool of human knowledge and arts? You made it, man. Whatever your misgivings and anxieties, at least in my mind, you're there at the very pinnacle with these works. I'm only sorry with your death there can be no updating, no new epithets, aphorisms and factlets about the artists contemporaneous with you and those still to come to insert into your book. Such is the nature of the beast that is the novel. Eventually all work gets frozen by and in time. If This Is Not a Novel was not mind-expanding enough, then Vanishing Point took it onto a whole new level, and inquiring to that one thing no writer can write about, their own death. Though, of course, the very nature of your approach meant you cited Virginia Woolf and Henry James as prior raising this most pertinent of points. Vanishing Point is you, the writer, David Markson's attempt to write his own death. Ahead of time, obviously. Not a mere obituary, but everything surrounding our approach to death and the snuffing of our light. A brave endeavour. One I've undertaken myself, inspired by your foresight. But that way only lies madness too. That employment of one's consciousness to try and probe its very own annihilation and cessation. Is that why you found such a fiendishly oblique way to approach it, which wouldn't threaten your own sanity? I don't blame you, but only salute you. Me, myself, I have to try and go closer. I hope you're up there in heaven or whatever passes for it, swapping anecdotes and epithets with the whole host of humanity's greats that you quote in your novels. But there again, if you were, then death would hold considerably less fear for us if we knew that was our fate. I wish you long life in death. Mark Nash. Dear Mr. William Gaddis, this is only a short letter to reflect that I have the bulk of your oeuvre yet to read and appreciate. But I couldn't help but reach out, having read your extraordinary final book, Agape, Agape. A work written against the grim reaper sands of time and only published posthumously. But what a work! I salute you for the grim dedication and devotion to getting it completed in time. A book about a writer battling against the clock to get his final work completed before his death. Is that metafiction? The negation of metafiction? I love that the writer character in his hospital room has skin like paper and staples in his bones. He has become the very embodiment of his life work. He has become a book. For that is all that will indubitably remain of him once he is committed to the grave. And the irony of the title, a word seemingly repeated, but the subtle accented final E points to it as the original Greek term for the all-embracing love of man that God has, offset by the gape that is death and the mouth of hell or negation, that lies agape as we lie on our deathbeds. You wrote your own death, man, and I found that inspiring. I'm currently doing the same, but have taken the precaution of starting mine a bit earlier. Though with the random nature of life, who can say that I've allowed enough time? I could go tomorrow. But the dignity and fortitude with which you achieved your endeavour drives me on. And yet for all that, the anger comes through on every paragraphless page of your volume. You remained an elitist to the end when it comes to all things art. You would have hated this internet age, and the democratised access it lends to both creativity and criticism. Some of that criticism opines that you are perhaps the sole author who ended his career more angry about the state of the world than he was when he started. Me, I find that admirable. Too often successful artists lose their edge with the greater comforts afforded by their success. I hope you're still raging up in heaven, representing us over the injustice and indignity that is the human condition. I will turn to your other works, I promise, but at just under 1,000 pages long, I need a block of time for me to do them justice, if the fates will afford me such time. May the chasm never close up, but remain forever agape, in both meanings of the word. Yours, Mark Nash. Shalom, Ronald Sukenick. I'm really sorry that I've literally only just discovered your work and your erstwhile existence as an author. I have just yesterday finished my first exposure to your work in the form of Mosaic Man, which I think is the most ingenious title of any book I've ever come across. The mosaic being both the patchwork elements building up a picture, but also a man of Moses, that is, a member of the Jewish race. For that is your theme. and inquire into the nature of Jewish identity as you wrestled with it in yourself. It is indeed a wonderful patchwork, the allusion in its structure to the Old Testament, and yet the sections on the Jew in 80s Poland, the vanished original ghetto in 16th century Venice, the Jew under Le Pen's France, the Jew in the US, in post-war guilt-ridden Germany, and of course in Israel itself. And you cannot find a template Jewish identity that you could apply to yourself. The American Jew has little in common with the European Jew, and the European Jew is far removed from the Israeli. All in all, a fascinating treatment. But I was saddened that in your writing you constantly felt the need to pursue truth through using truth. It's fine to use your own experiences and episodes from life in your fiction, but it is resolutely fiction that you're operating in, not fact. You were not writing memoir or biography, so why this insistence on truth? There can be no truth in fiction other than the emotions it prompts in a reader. I think it's a wonderful novel, even when you insert two fellow authors from your acquaintance and their reactions at appearing in your novel. But it is not truth, and as you keep saying, the protagonist increasingly experiences an invisibility and sense of erasure. That suggests to me that your method here didn't bring you any closer to the truth of your own quest for self. The postmodern techniques which I enjoyed only further plant this in the realm of fiction and artifice, rather than bringing you any nearer to truth. It is possible to employ narrative techniques that get us closer to how our minds actually work, and thereby closer to truth, such as non-linearity, simultaneity of thoughts, uncompleted thoughts, lost thoughts, etc. But even this would be executed within the confines of a work of artistic fiction. It brings us closer to how the mind works, but not to truth itself. And when you include the subjectivity of the self as the main character, well, you begin to see where I'm going with this. You're further distancing yourself from any shot at self-insight. But for all these paradoxes, I do want to salute the achievement of this book. I enjoyed it. I found it insightful, not into your psyche, but into the themes you were exploring. And for that, I thank you. Next year in Jerusalem, I have no idea where you're buried, although to want to be buried within the borders of Israel right now is not a particularly healthy thing. Bests, Mark Nash. Dear Sam, thank you. Thank you for taking us on the afflictions and burdens of the human race, and for refracting them and making them reasonably transparent in your art. All your plays, from the endless waiting for Godot to the shorter sketch such as Footfalls, offer us images with which to grapple with our existence in this world. Your novels suggest the impossibility of conceiving the very same, that language breaks down and crumbles in the face of randomness, absurdity, and ultimately death. Language only provides an endless shrill babble that can't even protest its lack and short-livedness. In the end, there is only the music of the words spoken, but it does not soothe the breast rendered savage by knowledge of its own decay. Your plays had the remarkable effect of being so hermetically sealed that they seemed only to refer to the world of theatre, Endgame's bleak blank stage beyond which explicitly there was no world outside, for example. And yet the plays also stand for all of humanity in the world. I lose myself often between the two levels, the twin scales. You discombobulate me as I feel we should all experience, for we are adrift, only most are unaware of such a state. Then there is the comedy and absurdity, which along with the demon drink in your case, seems to be the only defence we have against the crushing realisation of our own feeble mortality. Oh, and by writing about it, of course. I too use a sense of the absurd and finding the humour in events to buttress myself from the insidious creep of consciousness of my death and cessation. Yet the more you age, the more I am afeard these bulwarks will break down, and death's leering skull cannot be blocked out. Yet you managed it. You knew from the death of your father onwards that anything precious we accumulate to ourselves by way of relationship, love and creation will be snatched away from us. But still you forbore. Despite debilitating lows, you managed to find a way to express it all. but you can't write yourself away from death. You were an enigma in your personal life, struck by depression and morbidity, yet given to great humour, keen not to forge too many personal ties, including to your wife, who you made live in the house next door with a separate entrance to your own. Yet every personal testament is of your unstinting generosity and warmth. You found recognition absurd, yet demanded that not one pause in your stage scripts be altered, and as a director demanded full control. You fought the Nazis, but never breathed a word of your actual missions. You were so high-minded in your philosophical reflections, yet you loved playing and then following sport, despite your poor eyesight. A bundle of contradictions, but I think you were playing a part as much as any of your characters. Again, no real division between the illusory world of the stage and that of life beyond the theatre's four walls. I think no one since you has had such a grasp of the human condition, and I'm just so grateful you were able to get it down on paper for us to have a stab at appreciating it. I think when it came, you welcomed death, probably more with a shrug than open arms, but you were ready for it. I can only hope by the end of my own artistic endeavours to be in such a place ready to take my leave, with a body of work a fraction of yours having prepared the way for me. I hope, Sam, wherever you are, that you have done with losing. Yours, Mark Nash.